Well, before we can talk about the power of the vote on this episode, we want to take a look back at history. In 1776, or at the beginning of the United States of America in the late 18th century, only white men aged 21 and older who owned property could vote. And that continued pretty much unchanged until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was the landmark for women's right to vote. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was the key to ensuring that no one could be excluded from voting because of race. Between these points in history and the present, there are a myriad of other amendments and Supreme Court decisions and federal acts and state acts that have impacted the right to vote.
Holland, that is such a good history lesson and a reminder of the past and the importance of the building blocks of our national democracy, which is we the people. And we the people can't participate in forming a more perfect union if we don't know what this means or even how to do it.
Okay, so as we're talking tonight, thinking about the words that we use and the stories that we tell and how they impact our views on voting, I think we want to highlight some specific words. One would be gerrymandering, another disenfranchise, Jim Crow, electorate, constituents, and of course, suffrage. What are the stories behind the vote? Do our votes matter?
This is such a key episode, and we have two amazing guests at the Afterword table who will help us critically think through these questions and more.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
First tonight is Charnise Mangle. She is an author and teacher who advocates for civic responsibility, racial justice, and community understanding. So Charnise, welcome to the table. Please share a little bit more about you and what you're working on right now.
Well, hey, everyone. Hi, listeners. So glad to be with you all. Again, as Amy already said, I'm a high school history teacher. I teach United States history and the Constitution, along with government and economics. I'm a literacy educator, and I just love every single second that I get to spend with students, educating them on the core documents of our country and educating them on just how to get involved and how to be citizens who are exercising the rights that they have as citizens and as civic people in this great country. And so I also am a writer. I recently wrote my first ebook, Understanding Race and Racism in America, which was a collection of resources on race in the United States of America for self-exploration. I wrote that in response to the killing of Mr. George Floyd in late May. It was kind of my way of responding. I had a lot of people asking me questions in regards to why are the things that are going on happening? And so I just decided to write something that would kind of guide people as they began to get the information for themselves and kind of make some conclusions on their own. So that's kind of just a little bit about me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're excited to have you at the table.
And rounding out our conversation is Lawson Wetli. She's the co-president of the Greenville County League of Women Voters and serves on the board of the Greenville Redevelopment Authority. In her real life, she's an attorney. So thanks, Lawson, for taking time to be part of this vital conversation. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what's keeping you busy.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here and talk about this issue that's always important, but especially critical right now. So I am someone, as is true for many of us, there are seasons of life. And so I have been, more or less civically active at different points in my life. And also in the past several, 2, 3, 4 years, I've really upped my level of engagement. So, I joined the League of Women Voters. I joined the local branch of the NAACP. I think that both of those organizations are important. As you mentioned, I'm co-president of the League. I'm also voter registration chair for the local NAACP. And I personally have a mission of both using my own civic voice and encouraging others to connect the dots to, find and use their own civic power and their own civic voice to move the world in the direction that they think it should go. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to start with stories because at the Afterword, we really do want to marry the stories behind the topic that we're talking about. And tonight we're talking about the power of the vote. And so I'm going to ask you first, Lawson, what is your first memory of voting and how did you become civic minded?
So for me, I am a Generation Xer. And so for me, my sort of formative years were in the 1980s. I will always find asymmetric haircuts to be cool. It's been baked in. And the first election that I was able to vote in was in 1988. So the thing that was going on for me at that time, my earliest personal civic engagement was with the LGBTQ community. And so, for example, at the college where I was, which was the University of Georgia, Athens, I was in leadership with the local, then there were fewer initials in the acronym then. It was the Gay and Lesbian Student Group. And as people either know who lived through it or who, have heard of, if they didn't live through it, a big thing that was going on in the LGBTQ community in the 80s was HIV and AIDS. And so one thing that was obvious to me on a personal level and had a real personal, and community impact that I was very aware of was we were in a situation where people were dying, right? People were getting sick and people were dying. And all evidence was that society in general and the government that purports to represent that society didn't really care and was not motivated to protect people or help people. And it was obvious further to me that the reason for that was that the people who were being disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, which was, gay and bisexual men, especially men of color, it was IV drug users, it was sex workers, but that the people who were being disproportionately affected by this were being treated as disposable. And so for me, the thing that motivated me to be civically engaged in all kinds of ways. One example is the vote, but of course there are other ways like protest, like advocacy. But it was, connecting those dots personally of the government is supposed to represent us. And if it isn't, then one of the things that we can be doing is trying to motivate the government to more effectively represent us, again, through using the civic tools of voting and also the civic tools of protest and otherwise. So that's where I was in 1988 when I first voted.
I love the asymmetrical hair thing. I'm just laughing my head off at that. That's awesome. How about you, Charnise?
Yeah, I would have to say for me, my first memory is probably going to be in the voter line for the polls with my parents. I remember going there and being there with them and feeling kind of out of place. Honestly, the polling place where my parents vote at is the community around is very old and retired and very white. And so I remember walking into the church where my parents' polling place is and being there and it's smelling very old and not in the good way like grandma's apple pies, but more of like, mothballs and things. And for some reason that really scared me. And looking around at all the different faces that I wasn't used to seeing because I hadn't seen a lot of older white people. I had obviously white friends who were children and their parents, but not such older people. And they were all just kind of looking at my parents and I never really asked any questions or anything like that. But I remember just being really afraid and feeling very out of place. Like this wasn't whatever my parents were doing here. It wasn't really for us. That was my first memory. And I hate that it's not a great one, but I will say that those memories were redeemed not too long after that. When I was a senior in high school, I actually had a really great friend. Her name was Candace, and she was just super excited about the potential of having Barack Obama as our first African-American president. And she was one of his like young poll workers. And she wanted me to be that with her so bad. She was always asking me to be one of the callers in the call center and things like that to help him win the primary here in South Carolina. And I was always like, that sounds good. And I kept putting it off and, I'll help you do that. I'll come with you one day. And I never did. I actually never went and did that with her. And I actually really wish that I had, but during that time, she was really challenging me that I was the student body president, the co-student body president at Malden High School, which is where I went to high school at. But I wasn't really thinking about politics or civic or anything like that beyond myself having been a part of student council all 4 years of high school and being the student body president. I knew what that meant as a student, but I didn't know or understand what that meant in the broader scheme of things. And so it was Candace who really, really helped me to see that. And by the time that I came back to cast my ballot in the 2012 election, I was in a totally different place. Kind of to what Lawson said, I was in college and there were so many things going on and people were having conversations that I had never had before that were really challenging to me. And it really made me have to become more civic minded. And I would say that continued to develop as I became a history major at Clemson University and was often confronted with conversations of understanding our Constitution and the just intellectual beauty that document is, yet at the same time, the continual disenfranchisement that seemed to kind of always work alongside of it, and kind of teasing those things out and understanding why those things happened and what was going on and why those things were going on, I think has always been something that has helped me become more and more civic minded, because I really do believe that we, the people, have the ability to use our voice through our vote.
Powerful. Both of you have very different memories, but I appreciate where they kind of synthesize into that movement of civic mindedness. Amazing.
Amy and I shared our first memories of voting, or our first political memories, when we did an episode early this year on stories from the campaign trail. And I said that my first was the 1983 governor's race in Kentucky, which Martha Lane Collins won. She was the first woman and to date only woman to be governor of Kentucky. And at the time, she was the highest ranked Democrat woman in the U.S. But I remember that we lived with my grandparents, and they had different persuasions. One voted for one party, one voted for the other. So, there are those families where you cancel each other's votes out, right? It's a house divided. When we think about the impact of our votes, do votes really have an impact? Charnise?
Yes, I would definitely have to say that votes have an impact. They have a huge impact on us in our everyday lives. Depending on who you vote for or what you decide to do with your vote will impact you, whether you really want that to or not at the end of the day. And so what I mean by that is that you could choose to sit out and to say, I'm not going to vote this year for whatever reason, or 4 years from now, sit out and vote. Or maybe you sat out and didn't vote last year, but whether you use your vote or not, the votes that are cast are going to have an impact on you. And so at the end of the day, the majority is going to have their voices heard, and the people that they would like to align their ideology with will have a seat at the table and will be making decisions that will impact all of us. And so voting matters, in my opinion. It's important. It's the way and the means that we have in the United States. We have, a democratic republic. And so essentially what that means is there are going to be times where we directly vote people in and we indirectly vote people in. And there are going to be times when people represent us that we didn't have any say in, right? But at the end of the day, those people are the ones making the decisions. And so if you're not participating in that, then people are going to be making decisions for you that you may or may not like. And for me personally, even if someone gets elected who I may not agree with, at least I let my objection be noted in the books that is down for all time to know that I did not agree, that I, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg was famous for, I dissented.
Thanks for sharing that. What do you think, Lawson?
Yeah, I very much agree with Charnise. And I would say a couple of things. And I do think it's common for people to think that their vote doesn't matter in any one of a bunch of ways. And one thing I would urge people to consider is your vote literally matters. Like, no two ways about it, literally matters on the local level. And I think it's very easy for people to forget about down ballot races. So just for example, in the upcoming elections, so I live in Greenville County. And so all of us are voting for U.S. president. All of us in South Carolina are voting for a U.S. Senate seat. Absolutely all of us, wherever we are voting for a U.S. House member because they are up every 2 years. Here in South Carolina, all of us are voting for a state senator, and all of us are voting for a state House of Representatives member. Here in Greenville, all of us are voting for a sheriff. It's a county level, right? And so there's been a lot of conversation lately about appropriate policing. Well, we have a sheriff's election coming up. Many of us are voting for, I, for example, am voting for a county council member, and I am voting for a school board member. Now, people's lives are busy. And I totally understand that it's not easy for people necessarily to be, it can feel very inside baseball, sort of the people who know everyone who's running for school board. Also, there's reason to think that, I heard the other day that 80%, I'm not sure where the stat came from to be fair, but that 80% of the decisions that affect our day-to-day lives are made by local and state legislators. They are the ones who are making decisions about our roads, our schools. All of them are spending our tax dollars. They're making decisions about criminal laws and incarceration and policing. All of that stuff is happening at the local and state level. And it happens all the time that these elections literally come down to a very few votes. I mean, there are ties. It's not uncommon. So in that respect, 100% our vote, our voice matters in a very literal way. Also, on the broader level, if you look back at the 2016 presidential election, which these presidential elections, that's the one that it's easiest to find out about. So in the 2016 election, I'm that kind of fun person who actually remembers these stats right now. 29% of the voters, and this is out of the voters who were eligible to vote in that election. So 29% voted for Hillary Clinton, 27% voted for Donald Trump, 3 to 4% voted for third-party candidates. But the way biggest piece of that pie, 40 to 41%, didn't vote. So, and I'll bet a whole bunch of them were thinking, my vote doesn't matter. Why should I bother? And, I don't know. Some people may have thought, I'm not here to say, but just if any substantial proportion of that 40% had voted, fill in the blank, like Hillary Clinton could have won the Electoral College as well as the popular vote, or Donald Trump could have won the popular vote in addition to the Electoral College and had more of a mandate. Like, all of those people not voting could have made a huge difference. So absolutely, in all kinds of ways, our vote matters.
And I would love to just kind of also add that to your point, Lawson, about taxpayer dollars, it's like these are going to be spent, right, by these representatives. They are the ones who are allocating the different funds to the different resources and the different resources that they get. And so if you are thinking and sitting back and you're saying, I don't like how the money is being spent in my city, in my county, well, then you have to vote for the people who you feel like are going to do a better job of reallocating those funds. And so a lot of people don't understand that there are budgets, that there's funding that comes not only from the city and the county, but from also the federal government. And these people that we are electing are the ones who get to decide where those dollars go and who gets the bigger or the smaller pieces of the pie. And so when you're not voting, you're not allowing for those processes that are going to impact your day-to-day life, as Lawson said, to really do their best work for you as a citizen on your behalf.
Absolutely. And at the federal level, we're talking about trillions of dollars a year. At the state level, it is billions. At the county level, it is hundreds of millions. And I don't know how many people are motivated by pettiness. Maybe that's just me. But I can tell you that every time you don't vote, someone who disagrees with you about those decisions is happy you stayed home.
Wow. Holland, this conversation's on fire.
I think you need to run for something local, Amy. I've been saying that since January.
Oh my goodness. One quick clarification, and because we are the Afterword conversation about the future of boards, Lawson, you used a phrase, down ballot election. Could you kind of explain what that means for us and our listeners?
Thank you. Absolutely. So if you imagine your ballot and what's up at the top of it are the big elections like U.S. president. And so what you'll see, generally speaking, it'll be U.S. president and then U.S. Senate, and it sort of goes down. So the quote unquote down ballot elections, and thank you for the opportunity to explain, Amy. It's so easy to get inside baseball-y about this stuff. And so thank you for that opportunity. But the down ballot races are those local and state races that, come down later on your ballot and are, easier to kind of ignore in all kinds of ways, harder to find the information about. Although one thing I know, we'll have resources made available to people to make it easy as possible for people to research their candidates. But yes, down ballot races are local and state elections.
Excellent. So good. I'm learning so much already tonight. So let's move on to our next question. So 2020 marks the centennial of the 19th Amendment. There have been so many things that have been explaining and celebrating this historic event and the end of the women's suffrage movement for some, because it wasn't complete. 2020 also marks the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment and the right of Black men to vote after the Civil War. But even after these historic amendments, first of all, I'm going to hit you first, Charnise. What are the barriers that people have in our present day systems? Let's talk about some barriers to the vote.
Well, I mean, I could give you a long list. And so I'm going to start giving you some of those, right? So we have voter ID requirements, lack of language access, voter roll purges, polling place closures, and lack of funding for elections, right? We have reduced early voting, reduced voting hours, poorly trained poll workers. We have the creation of at-large local offices, right? So it's a daunting list that can go on and on and on, honestly, for forever. But I guess my main focus is really three that are always on my heart, which are voter ID laws, voting hours, and polling place closures. And the reason that those are always on my heart is that if we're creating obstacles for people to be able to register to vote, then it harkens back to the reason why we needed a 15th Amendment in the first place, to guarantee the voting rights of these newly freed African-American men. And then when I begin to see the voting hours just kind of close in, right, and the polling places close, it makes something that is already, even before those things would have taken place, difficult for people who work particular jobs that may not be able to be off or may not have the day off, that are already trying to work a very small window of 12 hours anyways to be able to vote, even smaller, and people who may rely on others for transportation or for public transportation. It's just like you're creating an obstacle that is so blatantly obvious that you are trying to impede on someone's rights, because it's not like it's happening everywhere, right? It's happening in specific places, in specific elections. These things are happening. And so those things are the things that are concerning to me today in our present system that we have, that really need to be addressed, that we need to be the voice, especially for those of us like myself, who will essentially have the day off and who can be available for other people to be available, but also to be their voice in the box. We've got to vote on behalf of those who are being marginalized, in my opinion, because honestly, a lot of the times, the different people who are put into place, because I find myself in these interesting categories, right, that are very privileged by and large. I have a car. I have all these different things that are going to make my life easy. I have a job that's pretty secure. All these different obstacles that other people have, I don't have. So when I'm voting, a lot of the times I'm not thinking of myself. I'm thinking of my neighbor, my brother and my sister that are in this fellow family of humanity that we have. And how can I elevate their life and use the privileges that I have to be leveraged on their behalf is what I'm really thinking of. So those are the obstacles that I'm always thinking of, is those voter ID laws, voting hours, and polling places.
Wow, those are very key. And I appreciate the way you've articulated them, because again, as you were sharing, as you all were talking about it, it's not that voting just impacts me. It impacts the greater humanity of our country. And I appreciate the way all of those kind of tie in together. I really have some things to think about. Thank you for sharing that. How about you, Lawson?
Yeah, to supplement what Charnise was saying, you know, all of those absolutely are current voter suppression modes. Something that really resonates with me, and this comes from my experience as a woman in the working world, where there have been a lot of times where I have been treated differently, and there's no doubt in my mind that it's because of my gender. But also, people don't just come right out and announce it, right? It's not like, hi, I am sexually harassing you. Like, that's not how it works. Well, similarly with voter suppression, people are not announcing what they're doing. Let's be like really, really clear that in all of those methods, nobody is saying, hi, here's the plan. We want fewer people voting, especially people that fit in these categories, where the categories currently absolutely are Black and brown people, are young people. Like, there are very specific categories, and this is happening for reasons because there are political parties that have concluded that it is to their, disadvantage to have people voting who fit in certain categories. But it doesn't announce itself, and it hasn't for a long time. So that 15th Amendment, right, which was in the 1860s and purported to make it constitutionally impermissible to discriminate on the basis of race or color, that wasn't taken off the books. What happened was the Jim Crow era made it, right, accomplished racial discrimination without announcing what it was. Okay, right? So like it's been a long time now that people are not saying the quiet part out loud. And that remains true. And I think that's important for people to realize, because the form that voter suppression comes, first of all, it always has a story behind it. And that story is typically the story of quote unquote voter fraud. So whenever these measures are promoted, it's either for voter fraud, quote unquote, or for efficiency, quote unquote. There's always an explanation that on its surface sounds like procedure, sounds like something. And I think it's very important to highlight that these stories are not evidence-based, because I think if people just hear them, nobody wants voter fraud. Nobody wants inefficiency. But at the same time, it's important to call these things out for what they are. And what they are is voter suppression. And it's death by 1,000 cuts, because a lot of these things make it harder to vote in small and incremental ways. And if you just look at any given one of them, people will be like, what's the big deal? But when you take them all together, it is having a substantial vote suppressive effect. And if I may, I would like to give two 100% current examples of this in South Carolina. So, and again, just think to yourself, what is it that makes it harder to vote? It makes it harder to vote if it makes it harder to get to the polling place, if it makes it harder to understand voting laws, if it makes it harder to register to vote, if it makes it harder to, get your vote in. In South Carolina, we have one of the longest voter registration blackout periods in the nation. So our state law says that you must register to vote 30 days before an election. So first of all, there's no real basis for that. There are lots of states that do same-day voter registration, and it works just fine. So there is no intrinsic problem with having a much smaller or no voter registration blackout period. Also, if you think about it, and I do because I'm a dork, 30 days before a Tuesday happens over a weekend, okay? Which makes the actual voter registration deadline complicated in South Carolina. So if you look at the voter registration deadline in 2020, there are 3 of them. Your voter registration in-person deadline is Friday, October 2nd, because those offices are only open during the work week, during business hours. So that's voter registration deadline number 1. Voter registration deadline number 2 is Sunday, October 4th, because that's online voter registration, which you can do over the weekend. And voter registration deadline number 3 is Monday, October 5th, because that's the postmark deadline to mail it in. Now, try explaining to people what their voter registration deadline is without, right? I mean, I'll bet people started tuning me out when I started saying it. It would be so much clearer for voters if you had a single voter registration deadline. P.S. A year ago-ish, it was, I think, 2018 or 2019, I forget, the local election officials asked the state legislature to change that and to make it a 25-day blackout period, which again would still be way longer than we need for a blackout period, but would have the signal benefit of having a single voter registration deadline, because I believe 25 days before a Tuesday is a Friday. Okay? And the current majority party in the legislature blocked it, stopped it. Okay? Well, that has a vote suppressive effect. Again, if you're having to describe 3 different deadlines to people rather than just being, you need to register to vote by, Monday, October 5th, that has a vote suppressive effect. That's one example. Another example that is happening right now. When you vote absentee by mail in South Carolina, there is a quote unquote witness requirement. You mark your paper ballot and you put it in an envelope and you, the voter, sign it to do your voter's oath, and then someone else needs to witness that. Now, that someone could be anyone. It could be a toddler running through your living room. There are no restrictions on who that witness can be, which is to say that witness signature has no meaningful effect. And election officials will tell you it has no meaningful effect. They are never going to go track down a witness to see if they really witnessed your signature. Also, in COVID times, if you live alone and you're doing an absentee ballot by mail, and you have to go find a witness to witness your ballot, you're exposing yourself and them potentially to COVID. So it has a public health negative impact. And our state election authorities specifically requested that the witness requirement not be required for this election, right? It doesn't benefit, it doesn't make the election safer, but it endangers people. A federal court last Friday considered that argument and decided, yep, you know what? Agreed. There will be no witness requirement, on that. That decision is being appealed. Okay. People in South Carolina are paying money right now to appeal that, to reinstate the witness requirement for absentee ballots. Does it benefit anything? No. Does it make it harder to vote? Yes. It's voter suppression.
Those are excellent examples and so current. And I appreciate the fact that for both of you, you're explaining that this idea of a barrier is not in your face, it's subversive. It's something that comes in little dribs and drabs, and pretty soon it's the frog in the frying pan, and you had no idea that you're being roasted. I really appreciate that. Thank you guys so much. This was incredibly educating.
Just to go back to something that was mentioned earlier, and that's the difference between the popular vote and the electoral college. Since we're right at a presidential election here, and that's the only time that comes up that I know of, could one of you explain, just make sure we all know what we're talking about when we say popular vote versus the electoral college? Charnise, you're a teacher. You want to teach us?
There you go. Okay, sure. I will be glad to give my rendition of it. This is what I would tell my students. I would say, students, you're wondering, how did we get to the 538 electoral votes in total? And I would say, well, you have 100 senators and you have 435 House of Representatives plus the 3 from the District of Columbia. And then I would say you need 270 in order to win the presidency. And I would say that we got that from our Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. Then I would begin to describe to them how many we have, I should say, actually in South Carolina, which we have 9, and it's based off of any state's population, and that can change based off of a census vote. So you know that we are having our 2020 census, and so once the census is collected and then they go through and they calculate the different numbers for the different states of how many people live there, you could get more, you could also get less, right? So it's all going to be determined based off of the state's population. So that's what I would say. And then I'm going to get a lot of questions. I'm going to get questions of, who are these people? Where do they live? Can I go talk to one? And then that's where 9 times out of 10, I'm like, love these questions. And it's real hard for me to help you understand some of this and to explain this to you, because I, Miss Mangle, am actually a little bit confused sometimes, because they ask some really hard questions that then we have to go and we have to research. And sometimes our research comes up very empty because they really want to get down. They want to know, like, who is this person? What is their name? And that is something that you are probably not going to be able to find. And so that's where I will throw it to Lawson to give us a little bit more information, because I feel like she is going to definitely know a lot more about this, and I'm about to learn something, and I'm super excited about it.
Well, I'm just going to lead by saying that the League of Women Voters supports getting rid of the Electoral College, because we believe that it is lowercase d undemocratic, that it's not a good system. I mean, I believe it's archaic. You know, a lot of the constitutional elements are based in things that just aren't relevant anymore. And what it has the practical impact of at this point, I think we all know there's a disconnect. States have the ability to elect U.S. senators, which has its own distortion going on right now because the population discrepancies between different states are so much larger than the founding fathers ever could have imagined. Like, it's a fundamentally different nation right now than anyone ever envisioned at that point. So to just answer the question of, you know, the Electoral College is the system of electing the president in which each state gets some ability to decide, once they get the popular vote within their own state, each state gets to decide how to apply that among its electors. Okay. But the way that most of them do it is it's winner take all. You know, so in most states, and I'm pretty sure South Carolina is one of them, if we have those 9 electors, if whichever person wins the majority of the popular vote for president in South Carolina, they're going to get all 9 of those electors. And so because most states do it that way, what it ends up happening, and did happen in 2016 and also happened in 2000, and I'm sure a few others, was even though people generally expect the Electoral College vote to match the popular vote, it doesn't. And it doesn't in ways that are wonky. It doesn't in ways that I think disserve all of us. I mean, a lot of people say, well, let's preserve the Electoral College because it gives a voice to the smaller states. No, it doesn't. It gives a voice to the swing states, because the only states the presidential candidates really have to worry about are the ones that might swing on election day. P.S. If California were a swing state, don't we think the fires out there would have gotten a lot more attention than they did? Right? Because it's to nobody's benefit to focus on California. Because it's not a swing state. And so there's that disconnect in the way that it does. P.S. There are ways of fixing this, which include, there's something called a National Popular Vote Compact, in which if enough states agree, because again, it's up to the states what to tell their electors to do based on the popular vote, a state can instruct its electors to vote according to the popular vote of the entire United States. And if you get enough states to agree to do that, it would have the same practical impact. But fundamentally, they're not the same thing. We are increasingly, or at least we increasingly recently have seen situations where there can be a disconnect between the popular vote and the electoral vote. And that's not a good thing.
Holland, do you feel like your question was answered? Do you feel more educated?
It was answered more thoroughly than I could have expected. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to round out our part 1 here, and we're going to ask a question that we ask at the end of each of our first episodes with our guests. And Lawson, what is an essential element we need to consider when we think about voting?
I think that the essential or unessential element that we need to do, one piece of advice that I've gotten that it's trite, it's whatever, but it's resonated with me, is fake it until you make it. I think all of us need to vote like it counts. You know, frankly, I think that's one of the things, because by the way, if you don't vote, you guarantee that it doesn't count. And so I think there's that. I think for everybody, there are systems in place, and one of them is money, where we all have to kind of believe in it to make it happen, right? If all of us collectively just decided that, a dollar isn't really worth a dollar, the system falls apart. Our elections are like that too. I encourage all of us, because this election, more than I've ever seen in my life and more than I hope ever to see again. I think people have real concerns about the integrity of the election. And I think it makes it that much more important for each of us individually to link arms and take that step of faith into voting.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Charnise.
I would say the essential element that we need to consider when thinking about voting is why. I'm always after my students about the why. And so in this case, it would be, why am I choosing to use my voice to vote today? When you understand your why in anything that you do in life, you're unshakable in it. You just go after it in a different way. There's just something that just, in my opinion, comes over you because you are able to stand and defend whatever happens that you participated in. And you kind of just, not that it necessarily is going to come to blows or physical fight, right? But it's like you are fighting within your own self to come to a resolution, right? And you're thinking, your critical analysis of the candidates and making a decision. And then you're going to stand in that truth, whatever it is that you decide. And then when people are asking you, if you decide to tell someone that whoever you voted for, and you're giving an answer for that, you are able to then explain that why. And so I just really believe that it's important for people to really understand and to consider why I am deciding to use my voice to vote on this day for these candidates, because obviously it's going to be more than just one, because there's going to be a long list. But why am I doing that? And to stand firm in that truth.
Thank you so much. That was, again, two wonderful essential elements.
Well, we're not stopping the conversation, but we do want to put a pause in it right now and say special thanks to Charnise Mangle and Lawson Wetli, and to everyone else at the table. While you're waiting for part 2 of our conversation on the vote, please go to the afterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. And as always, you are welcome at our table.